Greetings from Ann Arbor, Michigan, a great state and a great place of the great USA. Welcome to our podcast series, and I am promising you that this series is going to be very enlightening, very inspirational, a lot of fun, and something that will really, I think, help you as you walk your path to holiness. This series is going to have a lot of different things that you probably have questions about, but maybe have the opportunity to ask, especially about religious life. Like, what do they do all day? Who are they? Where do they come from? What's it like when a young woman enters religious life? So stay tuned as we will discuss where sisters come from today. Welcome back to Lumen Ecclesia Digital, or as we like to say, LE Digital. From Ann Arbor, Michigan, I am Sister Joseph Andrew Bogdanowitz, and I'm thrilled about this segment of our podcast, The Truth Will Set You Free. And this particular segment will be featured on one of my and your favorite devotions, the Holy Rosary. Now, you know what the Rosary is, and you, I'm sure, carry one in your pocket and have one with you all the time, because this is one of the most indulgenced prayers by the popes all the way down through many, many, many centuries. This is a prayer basically that St. John Paul the Great said was his favorite prayer. He actually said that at the beginning of his pontificate, which I think was telling us we better go to Jesus through Mary. And in another podcast you might remember, or look for it if you haven't seen it yet, we talk about that beautiful devotion of to Jesus through Mary, according to the great Dominican Third Order Saint, St. Louis de Montfort. So look for that one as well. But this is complementary to that particular devotion because they're to the Mother of God. And I want to say right away, because you might not really, maybe you have great devotion to the Rosary, maybe you do understand this, and maybe you don't. But it's important that we know the words of another great Pope Saint, and this is John the 23rd, who said that the Rosary really is a summary of the Gospels. Now, why would he say that? Let's go back in time. As early as the 3rd century, and I kind of would think maybe even before, we have monks in the desert and we have people counting out specific prayers. It's important to us. I know, and you probably do too, when my patience is tried, perhaps because I'm in a lot of traffic and I can't get where I want to go with the speed that I would like, or I'm in a long shopping line and nobody seems to be moving and the woman in front of me has, 50,000 things in her cart and I got there right 1 second behind her. These kinds of things. I have to have some patience, which isn't my natural virtues. So what do? I grab my rosary. Now, as a Dominican, and I'll explain why in a minute, as a Dominican, I have a 15-decade rosary. You probably can't see this whole thing, but it goes on and on and on and on, because after the 3rd century, as these prayer beads, we could call them, go down through the history of the church, through the history of people, and different other religions also have prayer beads as well. There's something in us that likes the tangible. It's kind of a reminder. We have our 5 senses. St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian, would say we have them on purpose because they bring us to God if we use them for that purpose. And the ability to feel. I don't like to just sit there and kind of think my Hail Marys. I mean, I could certainly do that, and some people do that. But I get distracted. Perhaps you have better attention than I do, but I do get distracted. And so when I hold on to my rosary, it's a constant reminder. Oh yeah, I'm praying the rosary. I need to meditate. The rosary is a contemplative prayer. It is a prayer of deep devotion, again, through the history of the church. Now, as we proceed into other generations after, say, the 3rd century, and we continue to go, the rosary took on different forms. It wasn't quite called a rosary at that point in time. Maybe it was called prayer beads. And again, other religions have prayer beads too for very good reasons, for similar reasons. But something momentous happened in the 12th century with the life of Saint Dominic, who founded the Dominican order that I am a sister in. Saint Dominic, and there's another podcast on his life and a little bit about our Dominican spirituality. So again, see that one. So you're just going to have to watch them all if you know what I'm talking about. Okay, that's good. I knew you'd agree. Okay, so as we proceed, let's talk about Saint Dominic. He had a deep Marian devotion. He knew, as a very intelligent man, I can't be strong enough for the world God has sent me into to bring back to God. We talked about the heresy that he had to live through, so many people attacking the church and everything, and he would see it in his heart. He would weep copious tears. His life, and those who knew him would write down. He would spend his days preaching and his nights praying, and he would fall asleep on the altar steps because he would be praying, and his life didn't have enough time to do both 24/7, as ours doesn't either. And while he was preaching in southern France against the Albigensian heresy, he did it for a number of years without visible results. Now, what would many of us be tempted to do? Give up. I've tried. It's not happening. I've just got to give up. There's other things I can do with my life, but not Saint Dominic, Mary's warrior. He went to Mary, and in prayer, he said, Mary, how can I bring these people back to your son? You know I have tried so hard. You know that I have given my life to this cause, and they don't listen. They don't seem to have grace or to open themselves, more appropriately, to open themselves to the grace of conversion. You, Mary, have to help me. What can I, as your son, do for your son, divine son, Christ? The tradition of the church says that Mary appeared to him holding the Christ child in one hand and a rosary in the other. Now, this is really, really neat. We love this. We love to tell this to little children, and you'll see why, but it's important for all of us. So, Mary said to Dominic, with this rosary you will conquer. Now, she held this and she called it a weapon. She said, actually, with this weapon, you will conquer. An interesting word. Remember, Dominic was in the Middle Ages, the medieval times, the ages of great heraldry and soldiers, and your weapon was your sword. And so we Dominicans wear our big 15 mysteries of the rosary that I showed you a few minutes ago. We wear these on our left side. Why? You might have figured it out. Because in the age of Dominic, the medieval soldiers wore their weapon, which Mary called this, their swords on their left side, because most were right-handed. And so to whip out that sword and to get fighting, you better have that sword on your left side. You just couldn't be pulling it out of your right side very easily, because your mobility and your strength is more so in your right arm. And so they would whip them out and go to battle. We, as Dominicans, you, as lovers of the rosary, you also keep that rosary with you. And we remind ourselves of that by wearing our long 15-decade rosaries on our side. Now, some of you are smart enough to be saying, okay, you mentioned St. John Paul II. You mentioned that he loved the rosary. So where are the other 5 mysteries? I'm holding them right here. Here are 15 mysteries, and here are 5. It's the 5 that you would be more familiar with. You're not going to carry around a great big Dominican 15-decade rosary, I don't think. But you will hopefully be carrying your rosary around. Remember, the rosary is a prayer of meditation, So many miracles have been worked on the rosary. Just look it up. You can look it up in any saint's life. I remember reading saints' lives one year just to find where they would talk about the Mother of God and their devotion to her and their devotion to the rosary if they lived after the life of Saint Dominic. So I really wanted to say, is every saint devoted to the rosary to the extent that they had the ability to know it? I would say yes, because why wouldn't they be? Why wouldn't we be attracted to the good, the true, the beautiful? That's another podcast, by the way. But right now, we're on the rosary. It's good. It's true. It's beautiful. What is the truth? The truth is it's meditating on the life of Christ. So we hold it and we think of the Mother of God. And again, in the words of St. John Paul the Great, we sit in the school of Mary with her son as she tells us about her son, as she explains to us the mysteries of his life. So as we go through the 15 traditional mysteries of the Rosary and then the 5 luminous mysteries of the Rosary that Pope St. John Paul the Great gave us, so he added to those, we think even of church history, we think of the development of these beads, which finally took the form of each decade being 10 Hail Marys and 5 decades for one group of mysteries, the joyful, the luminous now, the sorrowful, and the glorious. So ultimately, 20 mysteries of this rosary. And it doesn't matter which mystery you pray. You really should have your favorite ones. I think that's a smart idea. I certainly have my favorites. But at different times, I know when my parents, who I do believe are saints, when they were dying, and it was very, 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 I could go on many, many times with that, difficult, even with a great deal of faith, I did not want to let them go. Mainly because I didn't think I was going to be going home, perhaps in the super near future, and I was going to miss them. Now, the truth of that is a whole nother story. They are so present with me all the time. I still hear my mother's corrections and my father's laughter. And they are here, and they're keeping me on the straight and narrow. However, when I touch my rosary, I remember our family rosaries at home. I remember watching my mother and my father. I can still hear the click of the rosaries against the iron as my mom was actually ironing my father's shirts, our dresses, my brother's shirts. I can remember that click against that iron because she prayed the rosary as a convert from the Southern Baptist faith. She prayed it nonstop, as did my father. That's one lesson. If I could give the world, I think that would be what I would wish to give. A devotion to Jesus through Mary, and just hold on to the rosary. I think it's so powerful because it is highly indulgenced. There are many, many graces that flow through this, thanks to the popes, each one having a devotion, again, from St. Dominic on. Now, as we look at the joyful mysteries, we think of the beginning of the life of Christ, and we even go back a little bit before his actual life, but not in reality, because that first joyful mystery is the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel appears to Mary, this young Jewish woman, and asks her if she will be the mother of the second person of the Blessed Trinity, the Mother of God. Now, we might say, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? She was a good Jewish woman. Remember, she knew that meant the promised Messiah. She knew the Old Testament prophecies. She knew the scriptures. She knew the suffering songs of Jeremiah. She knew the suffering psalms in the Bible, the 150 Psalms of David. She knew her scripture. She knew she would have to be there and to watch as her son suffered for the redemption of us all. That would be a powerful question. Will you be the Mother of God? Mary said yes. She said yes because God had given her the grace ahead of time to say yes, but it would not mean her life would not be full of a co-redemption in a sense. The fact that she would walk so close with her son, that she would feel each wound as her own. And sometimes I think a mom can feel some things even more intensely than the child that she loves so much, and look at the child and wish she could suffer for that child. Don't we do that with people we love? I remember watching my parents, my mother consumed by 4 kinds of cancer, my father watching her and his heart just bleeding out. God, let it be me, don't let it be her. And me saying, let it be me, don't let it be either of them. But that wasn't the divine will. And somehow God's grace does get us through. But why did we pray continuously by Mom's bed for the last 2 weeks of her life as she lay dying and in deep, deep pain? We prayed our rosary. That was the strength of our family growing up. That remains the strength of our family. That's the strength when I go into a classroom and begin teaching. First thing I teach, if it's biology, if it's human anatomy and physiology, if it's music, if it's philosophy or theology, I don't really care. I'm going to teach them the rosary because that will bond me and my students, and we'll be able to get through the hard days, the February gloomy days, the days when nobody wants to come to school, including their teacher, me. And yet, that's the divine plan, and it will get them through their family difficulties so many, many, many times. I want to tell you a story of a student I taught some years ago, and this was actually in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a high school biology student. And he was a very difficult student for me to teach. Probably his personality was a lot like mine. He was pretty nervy. He was pretty in your face. And when he didn't want to study, he'd make it very, very clear, et cetera, et cetera. So at Christmas, because there would be a Christmas break and we would come back for the second semester, I went to the principal and asked, this is the only time I've ever done it, could this particular student be moved to the other teacher for the very same class? Could we just exchange a student? Didn't seem like a big deal to me. Certainly would make my life a lot easier. And I was thinking it would make his easier too, because neither one of us was winning the war, you see. Well, he promised me it would happen. At least I took it as a promise. I got back after Christmas, and don't you know, there was this student. And I said, wait a minute, you're supposed to be in the other room. And he said, well, it didn't reflect that. So I said, well, you know what? You're going to the back corner of the class because you cut up and you caused so much commotion. I'm so sorry, but I really do have to teach. You go back there. That way you can continue to listen, and maybe if nobody pays you any attention, including me, you'll learn it's really not worth the effort. Well, he just looked at me. So then he sat back there complaining that sister shoved him in the corner and all this other kind of stuff. I ignored him. Then one day, I'd had it because it didn't really stop. So I thought, I'm going to give him something. Now, this student was not a Catholic, but I knew he loved God. And so wherever he was in his particular faith, that was between him and God. But I began seeing greatness in this guy, and I was determined I was going to turn this around. I made him a rosary. I gave it to him one day, and I said, I know that you don't exactly pray this. I've noticed that in class because I always begin my classes with the Decade of the Rosary. He'd stand back there and wiggle around. And I said, but you too know how much this means to me. And I can't think of anything that I could have done or could have given you other than to make you this rosary and to give it to you and to say, I believe in you. You're going to become great. And I said, and I pray for you daily. And hold on to this rosary because it's blessed, and don't you ever lose it, and you remember it as the days, weeks, months, years of your life go on. It was maybe a dozen years, maybe not quite that much later. And he wrote me a letter, and I would hear from him every once in a blue moon. He went on to university, graduated with an excellent degree. The guy was brilliant. Got a very good job, and he decided he wanted the science aspect, but his was more in landscaping. So we got a landscaping job. One winter morning, he was in his truck going to his job, and the truck went over black ice, and it careened out, and he went down through this gully into these trees, and the rosary, that rosary, he was fishing for in his pocket as he was careening down this hill into trees. The rosary fell. Instantaneously, he bent down to pick up that rosary. So he was bent down when there was a crash. As he grabbed his rosary and tried to come back up, his face touched a tree that had come through the front of his truck, through the window. If that had been his head or his chest, he would not have lived to tell me about that. He wrote me to say, Sister, our rosary, Mary's rosary, saved my life. That many years later, he still had it. He still believed. There are greater things in life than things you or I will ever be able to accomplish. But God can accomplish them through us if He wants to. We can't be moved on our own power. We can't expect ourselves to go through the hard things in life with any interior peace if we don't have a faith that buoys us up, that gives us that constant sense of hope, that really says to us, this too is somehow according to the divine plan, and it will be good. No, we can't understand it. We're not supposed to. We're not God. And yes, we will try to, because we are human and we have these beautiful gifts called the human mind. But it can never grasp the mind of God. We are so infinitesimally smaller, yet He died for us. We are loved. We are loved forever and eternally and perfectly. And if we tap into that love, and sometimes I think it's great to have a rosary. Certainly better to pray the mysteries of the rosary as we go through the biblical life of Christ, all the way from the Annunciation, which we mentioned, through the visitation, when Mary went to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was pregnant with John the Baptist, and she went to help her, to the birth of Christ, the great feast we call Christmas, to the presentation of Christ in the temple to give this Jewish boy back to God. And then to the finding of Christ in the temple at 12, when Mary and Joseph were there on their good Jewish duties and could not find their son Christ. Then we go into the sorrowful. And I don't need to go through all the mysteries, find them and go through them. I could do a whole thing on the mysteries of the rosary, but I'm moving along because the sorrowful are exactly what they say. And I know when I watched my parents suffer, and so many times of my life, when I've taught students whose parents have suffered or they themselves have suffered, we all know suffering. Those become my favorite mysteries. But when life's a little bit lighter, I think of the resurrection, and I'm joy-filled. And so those two mysteries. And then the day in and day out, I do have to say I have grown in deep devotion to the luminous mysteries of the Rosary. What did Christ do during His life? So if the joyful leave Him at 12 years old, being found in the temple by His parents, then what happened until we get to the first sorrowful? Well, Pope John Paul the Great, who loved the Rosary, remember, as his favorite devotion, along with, I think, many, many saints and many good people. But if he did, then he asked that same question, what happened and why don't we have the day in and day out of Christ? We don't really know those first 30 years when he was with Mary in Nazareth, and that was the majority of his life. That's 10 times what we do know a little bit about, which is called his public life at age 30 before he was crucified at 33 and suffered and died and rose for us. But what did he do even in his public life? There are so many parts as you read Scripture, you want to stop and say, gosh, that kind of reminds me of myself, or that kind of reminds me of what happened the other day, or that reminds me of a particular story I heard one time, or that reminds me because our lives parallel Christ's life. We find ourselves in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this rosary is a compendium of the Gospels. And it's a compendium, I might say, of the entire Bible, in the sense it begins with a Jewish woman. And the last mystery of the Rosary, Christ wanted to highlight His mother again. She's crowned Queen of Heaven and Earth. Do we not need that mother? Are we so strong we don't? Well, that's ridiculous, and good luck if anybody's thinking that. The truth is we need them, and they're there for us. They too lived this life. They too suffered. They too understand us. One thing that I want to mention, and some of you might remember this, but all of you need to know this date, May 13th, 1981, the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima. The Rosary is very tied into Fatima, the apparition of Mary 101 years ago. The apparition by which she appeared holding the rosary, and she begged the three little children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, to pray the rosary for the conversion of sinners. And we were heading into a war, and we were in the midst of World War I, heading into eventually what would be World War II, etc. And she begged them to pray the rosary so that sinners would be converted, so that the world would find again the peace for which God created us. So it's very tied into this. John Paul II knew that. On May 13th, 1981, he was shot. It was the attempted assassination in St. Peter's Square. And remember, Aliaga, who actually held the gun, who did the shooting, when John Paul II, after many months in the hospital, went to see him and to personally forgive him, Aliaga said, "I don't understand. What are you? Who was it? I'm an expert marksman. What power was it that kept me from shooting you? It was a direct shot. I had you. How are you still alive?" And John Paul II said, "Your hand fired the gun, but another hand, meaning the Mother of God, guided the bullet." Amazing. Miraculous. God wanted us to continue to have this great saint here on earth because he had lots more to do. That was May 13th. That's the feast of Our Lady of Fatima. That wasn't lost on Pope John Paul II. In fact, from his hospital room, he asked that the memoirs of Sister Lucia be brought to him. The third secret, if you remember that, really was a prediction of what he had just lived through. And in that, we remember that 1 year to that day, May 13th, 1982, that Pope was kneeling in Fatima, and he was presenting to the image of Our Lady of Fatima there. He was presenting the bullet that the doctors had taken out of him that almost had caused his life to end. Now, if you go to Fatima, you will see Our Lady holding a rosary, the image, the statue, and you will see, if you go through the museum, because they use it on very special days, certainly May 13th and other days, you will see the crown with the bullet inside it. He asked to see the crown. They took it off the statue. This is in 1982, May 13th. He took the bullet out of his pocket. He put it in a small hole that was just happened to be in the top of the crown. It snapped immediately into place, like Mary had prepared that for the gift of her son. We could go on and on with miracles of the rosary. Get your rosaries. If you don't have them as you're watching this, carry your rosaries. Be sure your rosaries are blessed by a priest, but know the power just even in touching them. We need all the good on our side. We need the memories. We need to know how to plug into the strength of our faith. This is tangible. I love tangible things because they remind me of something. A bunch of beads, some chain, my particular medals of devotion, the crucifix. Yeah, it's not because of what this would cost on the market, so to speak. It's because this is blessed, and this is a reminder, an assurance that we walk with the mantle of Mary over us, protecting us, and we walk hand in hand with Jesus himself. Our lives are like other scriptures alongside his life. We too are in the Old and the New Testament. And we too will find our way to heaven holding these rosaries, praying these rosaries, and guiding others to know the beautiful secret that St. Louis de Montfort called The Secret of the Rosary, which is the name of one of his beautiful books, because he too is impassioned with the love of Mother Mary. So may we have that same devotion, that same great love. And may you pray for your children, especially the ones you might worry about, on your rosary. And may you pray for world leaders and world peace on your rosary. May you pray for peace in the hearts of your family, your friends, and in your own heart, because God abides in peace. And when we know he is testing us, think of the sorrowful mysteries. But remember, they don't end the rosary, neither do they end the scripture. It goes on to the resurrection. and the fact we too will follow Christ from the grave into our eternity. So pray with the rosary all the way, with Mary leading you in her school of love and devotion. Thank you. So if you like the material on this particular podcast, then please click on the next podcast for another fascinating story.